Andy, thank you for coming on and joining us today on TartleCast. I know I certainly get my fill when it comes to philosophy. Anyone who's an avid listener knows that it's one of the things that gets me out of bed in the morning.
Hmm.
And you wrote a wonderful book called Mental Immunity. And not only is it something that's timeless, what you speak about, it's also quite timely. And I state that because, as you know, there's a lot of misinformation out there, and a basic tool that we all lack is pretty much a filter for
Yeah.
ideas, right?
Yes. Exactly. And
So yeah,
that's
no, I know it sounds like I know you're ready to run with a thought. So here, let me tee you up,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So when I had read this book, it gave me quite a wonderful framework, and I also shared this off air with you. Is that you have the ability to take something from antiquity and then apply it to how we understand very physical science now. So I took something very, nebulous in a sense, very non-tangible, and you made it very tangible for a reader, someone now today in our current scientific astuteness for how we look at our world, and
Mm.
says, let's make a bridge, and then from that bridge create a framework for how we understand ideas and information that we receive in the world around us. Am I kind of getting around the right point here?
Absolutely. Shall I riff on that?
Yeah, I would love a good riff on it. Yeah, please. That would do.
Yeah. Well, I'm really grateful that you saw the connections between sort of my study of the deep philosophical questions going back thousands of years and our predicament today, which I
Yeah.
think is kind of scary given the way in which disinformation is dividing us and animating different kinds of extremism. So it turns out that philosophers have been wrestling with the disinformation problem for a long, long time. We've been trying to figure out how to think in responsible ways, reach reliable conclusions, both about the nature of reality and about what really matters.
Hmm.
And it turns out that an ancient technique called the Socratic Method, pioneered by a Greek sage named Socrates, it's basically an idea testing method that can allow you to do a better job of filtering out the ideas and information that come your way. So there are a lot of minds these days that are infected by bad information, and this is causing people to act out in ways that are harming our nation and our world. And so the solution, I argue in the book, is to bring back the Socratic method, make it simpler, more powerful. We can actually refine it into something that essentially inoculates our minds against the worst kinds of disinformation.
That's I gotta say it's sharp. So there's a couple points here we're gonna have to unpack. And the first function of this is when did we start to trail away from the Socratic method? Right. So if I go back to Greek philosophy, there was this, and this is essentially pre-Stoicism that you would find in Italy, but I'm trying to understand the natural aspects of the world and man's alignment with that naturality, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then that later post enlightenment, and you got Hume and stuff like that showed up, the Scottish philosopher. But was science the turning point for us? That deep focus on what you would call natural philosophy, trying to understand this sort of scientific approach to questioning the world and understanding how nature works. Is that when we kind of diverted away from the idea of thought and strictly focused on a material thing?
So the scientific revolution happened in a period of European history called the Enlightenment,
Right.
and that came on the heels of what historians call the Dark Ages.
Mm-hmm.
So the Dark Ages were a time when religious orthodoxies and superstitions basically prevented free inquiry and honest inquiry from really happening uh, in Europe. And disease was rampant, warfare, lives were short, nasty, brutish, and short, in the
Right.
words of Thomas Hobbes. Um, and then a new spirit of free inquiry and critical questioning emerged in the Enlightenment, and it gave rise to the scientific revolution.
Hmm.
And in the scientific revolution, we learned a very powerful new way of understanding the natural world. And we call it the scientific method today.
Yeah.
And it's basically a way of testing ideas in a systematic way and getting rid of the ones that don't survive the testing. And we've gotten at least part of our culture has gotten very, very good at letting science do its thing, trusting its results where it has more insight than we do. But of course, we're seeing many people push back against science. There's science denial today that seems to be moving us backwards in some kind of scary ways.
Do you know that's interesting? Because some people take their careers and they focus specifically on scientific method. That is what they do, right? The way
Mm-hmm.
they are paid, everything, the way they publish scientific method. And then for laymen and the general public, wherever that might be, they're not experts in that specific field.
Right.
Nor do they have, most of the time, foundational understandings within their own mind, whether with how nature works or other basic laws, to say that, maybe there is some muster to what that person's hypothesis for how things work in their scientific field. Maybe there is something to it, but there's nothing to test against it. And
Right.
so the way I've seen it's an interesting paradox here is that people are putting in research, they're doing the science, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're having the hypothesis, trying to understand our world and how we interact with it. And then when they deliver that information back to others, it then turns into a system of belief where
Mm.
these individuals look at the science and they're like, well, I can't really test against it because I have no foundational basis to do so. Or I have no foundational basis to even say, what's a logical process for how they actually got to this point? And I don't even know how to entertain that logical process. A lot of us are like, am I towing a straight line here? And
Yeah.
from that, when you have belief, then it's like, well, scientists have been telling me this is how the world works, but something different happened for me. And so now I don't believe you. And
Right.
so they'll push against it. And then you have this huge cultural uprise, right? And if you're Socrates, they kill you for questioning things. So it's like, it's funny how it's like it's moved into the scientific method, but the ones who are listening and receiving that information have taken it as belief in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
One little sliver of it does not work for their own personal life
Right.
because they haven't logically thought it all the way through. They turn against it. And then they infect that idea into many other people to say, look at my belief system.
Right. So if you study what's happening among, say, conspiracy theorists, I'm thinking QAnon followers
Sure.
or flat earthers, you can actually go out there and study what the kind of things they're saying, the kind of arguments they make, the kind of questions they raise. And it turns out that your average flat earther is extremely gullible in certain respects,
Right.
but they're also hypercritical in other respects. So what some people do is they hear that the idea that the roundness of the earth might be the result of a giant conspiracy, and then they start
I'm
digging.
sorry. It kills me every time.
Well,
We've
it,
gone. It's good.
your laughter is correct. I mean,
Yeah.
it seems silly, right? We have photos from space showing the earth to be stubbornly spherical.
Right.
But what some people do is that they get intrigued by this idea that the world is really flat and that we've been sold a bill of goods on it. And they start digging on the internet, and YouTube or whatever else feeds them a bunch of videos that makes them feel like they've done due diligence.
Yeah.
And the fact is, they're getting wildly unreliable
Hmm.
information that does not pass even the most basic scientific standards. But because not everybody's educated in the right way to test ideas, they become they get swept up in this, and sometimes they being in on a big secret makes you feel special,
Oh,
right?
yeah. I feel special reading your book. I'm like, I like this secret. Let's share. Yeah.
Well, I hope you hope that doesn't put my book into the category of conspiracy theories, but
No, 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 not at all. Just listen, Andy, there's no conspiracy around quality thought, right? And when I look at um, how when I look at nature does things in quite a regular pattern. And if I think about it deeply, if there was any illogical aspects to nature, the universe would essentially fold in on itself.
mm,
There has to, logic says, if I go back in this, that something at a very base causal level has to be so fundamentally logical and
Mm.
everything must abide by it.
Mm.
Otherwise, it would fold in on itself. Now, for
Yeah.
instance, I think about this in the terms of like miracles. People are like, oh, that's a miracle. Well,
Hmm.
if we had miracles, then physics would run into a lot of issues because anytime they would coin a flaw, like a law, you know, when is that law going to just turn into dust? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You can't have miracles. We just have things that currently sit outside of our understanding.
Right. So philosophers going back over, well, almost 3,000 years had basically noticed, what? The world seems to operate according to certain regularities.
Right.
And we can study those regularities and understand the underlying forces.
Yeah.
And when we understand the underlying forces, we become better able to navigate the world that we live in. So, for example, um, every one of your listeners probably owns a cell phone.
They do.
And their phones actually rely on technology that adjusts radio signals from satellites for relativistic distortion. So Einstein's theory of relativity says that time actually morphs the closer you get to a massive body like the Earth.
Yeah.
If scientists hadn't taught us, if physicists hadn't taught us how to make those adjustments, your phone wouldn't be able to communicate properly with satellites.
No. Frankly, there'd be a huge delay in me speaking to you. I would speak and then the latency would be ridiculous. But you look at that sort of thing like time and distance or space time and time space. But I don't want to get crazy about this, even though it'd be easy to. What I'm saying here is that when you talk about thought, if I don't have a scientific basis for understanding many, many things, it's
Mm-hmm.
fundamentally important that I understand how I think. And then through
Yes.
my thinking, I can then understand how to operate.
Right.
And from my looking at this world and my reason, I understand that I am, without a doubt, a part of nature. I eat vegetables all day long. I consume all these other chemical, mineral nutrients that come in and define what my physical body is. So
Mm-hmm.
I am bound by the same laws that I see that currently happen around me with great regularity.
Yeah.
But there's good simplicity to it. So if I can look at the simplicity of, and I'm looking out the window right now at some plants, if I'm looking at the simplicity of nature, well, then I can look to the simplicity of my thought to say, there's great reason and logic to what nature is doing. How can I also apply that to my train of thought? So when I read mental immunity, I'm like, fantastic. You talk about viruses, inoculations, spreading, disease, things of that quality, but those, whether it be a virus or a plant in a greenhouse, they're
Mm-hmm.
still bound by the same laws for how they grow, bifurcating those things. And so, how do we
Yeah.
take that framework and then apply it to our everyday thoughts? So, regardless of me having a PhD or me being a bricklayer, I can still understand with my own rationale over a great period of time that that's the most logical way to go about things.
Right. So the the big so for a long, long time, scientifically minded people have been saying, we need to do a better job of testing not just our ideas about the facts, but also our ideas about what's right and wrong.
Right.
We need to examine our beliefs about morality and throw out the ones that aren't serving us well. And that's a tricky process, and one that philosophers like myself are have literally spent decades studying how to do that right. And it turns out there are many, many ways that thinking can go off the rails. Um,
Nazism,
Nazism is a perfect example. I
you
think
know?
I would include QAnon and
Correct.
Stalinism, right?
Yeah.
Certainly. I mean, there are you can find examples on the left and you can find examples on the right
Hmm.
of what I call basically really bad mind infections that have gone viral. And we see bad ideas spreading virally all around us these days. And the question is, what are we going to do about it? And in the book, I argue that we actually need to bring the tools of virology and immunology to bear on our mental issues. So, if we're going to think together well, think together properly, we need to understand a few things about our minds. Number one is they can become infected with bad ideas. Mind infections can spread like parasites. and that and we need to strengthen our mind's immune systems so that we're not vulnerable to mind parasites.
So you mean like a super bullshit filter?
Super bullshit filter. That's a nice way to put it. That's a nice way to put it.
It's one of my favorite things. And, people, I even get this from some of my employees with me. They're like, "Man, you can be a little terse," and it's like, I'm really not trying to be rude, but if we think this through, it just doesn't seem very logical, does it?
Right.
But you can't, and I've found this over the course of my own life. You can't tell people they're wrong. They have to figure it out for themselves.
Right.
The Socratic method is one thing where, you do that testing,
Mm-hmm.
posing the question back to them essentially as a statement,
Mm-hmm.
but it allows the person the time to ruminate on it.
Yes.
But through this questioning, and a lot of people back away from it because sometimes it becomes something very emotional for them, and it's hard for them to just be like, I'm trying to have an argument for argument's sake, but not to really upset you. I just want to find out for my own process of learning,
Right.
you know? And so it's a tough thing to do, but they have to figure it out for themselves. And I just love how you bring it back to say, hey, look at this framework. Look at
Well,
virology. Look at immunology. Let's look at these things, understand how a virus can use that framework, but you can too for your own benefit.
thank you for saying that, Alexander. So here's a simple, practical thing that I think maybe everybody can appreciate. Um, when ideas take up residence in our minds, they start to take on the feel of a belief. They start to
Mm-hmm.
feel like they're part of us, like part of our mind. Right? We become invested in the ideas that work for us and that stick around for a while. And then when somebody comes along and raises questions about it, we tend to get defensive. We tend to feel as though the questions are an attack on us personally
Yeah.
rather than just these ideas that have taken up residence
Oh
in our mind.
man, if I can only talk about my past relationships, right? Like,
Well, but there's an alternative to taking it personally when somebody questions one of your ideas. The alternative is to say, okay, I am not my ideas. I am not my beliefs. Many of my beliefs will eventually reach their limits, and it'll be a good idea to part with them.
mm-hmm.
In fact, ideas usually serve you fairly well within certain bounds, and then if you push them a little bit, it turns out the beliefs are approximations at best, and probably best let go of. So a practical thing to do is try not to identify with your beliefs and hold your beliefs loosely. Be ready to part with them when somebody raises a sufficiently good reason
you know, you're,
to
you're
advance it.
you're touching like really sensitive areas, and I'll say this for this factor: many people believe in higher powers. They
Yes.
believe in deities, or they believe that their government should do something for them.
Mm-hmm.
Belief has always been interesting for me. It's kind of like my trigger word because it says I don't really need to take responsibility for how I think, and I can pass it off to somebody telling me what the supposed facts are.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that lacks an evolutive purpose, an evolutive mechanism for human beings. Frankly, I think belief slows our evolution and it weakens the mind, right? And it allows your ego to come through and say, I don't need to be rational. I can just believe in something and then run with that and say, that is my framework for the world. And,
Right.
and I got to get into this. So, and please do not take any offense, but you opened up your book with the shooter in the synagogue.
Mm-hmm.
Jewish faith is a very strong group. It's a strong tribe. 100%. I
Mm-hmm.
know it. I have a lot of beautiful, wonderful Jewish friends, and I've celebrated a lot of fantastic festivities with them.
Yep. As do I. Yep.
And a lot of that comes from belief that this is how we should live.
Mm.
But that also goes for Muslim religions, Zoroastrianism,
Right.
Brahmanism, all that stuff. But those things carry over, and it can actually cause people to do things they otherwise shouldn't logically be doing. That would actually cause harm to them or prevent them from evolving, right? So
Mm-hmm.
Do you this is I have to ask this. Do you carry a faith, Andy?
Um, I guess I'd have to say no. So, at least insofar as faith involves clinging to a belief in the absence of or in the face of evidence, I
Yeah.
would say I believe that faith in that sense is actually harming humanity's prospects.
Okay.
Now, there is something that is very faith-like, which I call resolute hopefulness.
I like that. I do like resolute hopefulness. That's a very optimistic way of looking at the world.
I
Okay.
think it's perfectly understandable that people would need ways to render themselves more hopeful in the face of trying times. And
Hmm.
I completely get that people need coping mechanisms for despair and anxiety. And if but rather than cling to beliefs that make you uh, feel as though uh, an all-powerful being will reward you, there's an alternative. You can satisfy your need for belonging, your need for connection, it, with a community of inquiry rather than a community of belief. So it's very important that people bond together tightly around shared values,
Right.
but we don't have to bond together tightly over shared beliefs, especially
Hmm.
beliefs that are really don't withstand scrutiny.
Yeah.
That's where religious faith, I think, becomes harmful to humanity's prospects. But by all means, get together with fellow congregants and swap ideas, test each other's ideas, support each other, celebrate justice and truth and honesty and kindness. These are all important values that it's important to share and reinforce with one another. And
Yeah.
if you can boost one another's hopefulness, ideally you do that without having to teach them things that you don't really know.
Yeah. And how many people are quick to teach you, something that they think they're an expert in or whatever it might be. And then no offense to them, but you look at them and the choices they made in their life and they'd be like, that seems quite hypocritical, right? There's a good portion of us, they talk the talk, but they don't want to walk the walk.
Well, I think the rub comes when beliefs you become fond of resist the pressure of new evidence or
Hmm.
new information that really ought to help us evolve, help us learn. So new information comes in, the person with a healthy mind will learn from the new information and adjust their beliefs on the fly. And by the way, you can train your mind to be so supple that it responds quickly and in a resilient way to new information rather than to push back against any information you find threatening.
So yeah, that's really sharp. So for instance, I'll use you and I as an example. We don't really know one another, Andy, do we? We're
About 20 minutes now or something.
about 20 minutes now, right? But if I don't lack the suppleness of my mind, the flexibility, the adaptability of my thoughts, if I don't sit here and listen to what you're articulating, it becomes very difficult for me to then test my own systems that I'm currently working in here and then also bounce them back to you in an effective conversation. There's learning that happens when I listen. And you have critical thinking and critical listening, right?
And of course, to really listen to someone is to become slightly vulnerable. Is
Hmm.
it's to actually open yourself up to the possibility that you might not have everything all figured out, right? So there's a humility. So when you meet a stranger for the first time on a podcast and you trust them enough to listen, that's something similar to faith too, right? Trust and faith are close cousins.
Yeah.
And trust is really important. And it's really important that we engage strangers with an attitude of initial trust, with an openness to the possibility that they're probably friendly and we can learn from them.
Yeah.
Um, the problem is that the trust and cooperative spirit that underlies science and that underlies so much of what we value in civilization is being eroded by culture warriors who are trying to pit us against one another,
Yeah.
who are making themselves rich by peddling anger and and dissatisfaction online. And when we listen to those people and allow ourselves to become disaffected, we start to distrust people we really ought to extend trust to. And what the new science is showing is that our minds don't function properly to filter out bad ideas when we become hyper suspicious or hyper distrustful.
Yeah, it's like the super skeptics. And this is truly interesting. So, and I know I've used this analogy before. The gentleman who started Kodak, he wasn't really interested in photos. He was really interested in how the mind and the eyes perceive objects at distance.
Hmm.
So hopefully I round this out like a good comedian here.
Hmm.
If we don't know what to look for, or we've lived our life with a specific framework of how we see the world, we tend to miss the truth or the things that are so blatant and obvious right in front of us. Now, for
Hmm.
instance, he studied a lot of the periods when the conquistadors would show up to the very tribal groups in Central and Southern America. They had no concept of what a boat is, right? You're essentially hyper skeptical or hyper ignorant of the fact of what other cultures or science may be doing. So when they show up, even though they might be in front of you, you can't perceive the truth that's right there
Hmm.
because fundamentally you're crowded by the upbringing and understanding of the culture, the tribe that you're currently in, and how they are perceiving that world live and operate. And you can
That,
become deeply infected by that thing.
well, the science fiction writer, I think it was Arthur C. Clarke, said, or maybe it was Isaac Asimov, I forget. He basically said any sufficiently advanced technology is effectively indistinguishable from magic
Yeah,
from the perspective of somebody to whom that technology is brand spanking new.
right. And so now we run into this issue here, okay? And you'll enjoy this. I go to come to you, and not from a hierarchical state, but assume that I am more evolved. And I would like to share a piece of truth with you. Unless I have a foundational understanding, whatever you tell me is essentially a lie. It will feel like an attack on me because
Mm.
I do not understand from the perspective of understanding myself to understand others where you're coming from.
Hmm.
So when I look at the world, right, I would want people to say, okay, I understand who I am. And through respecting who I am and those thoughts, I can then look to other human beings in the hope that they also respect me as a human being. So,
Hmm.
outside of religion, outside of faith, the very obvious things is that we're all interconnected on nature within a closed system on this planet. And a base fundamental thing is that the cells in our body, viruses, whatever it might be, are all trying to evolve.
Hmm.
There's a learning that is happening on a
Yes.
cellular level, chemical, whatever it might be. Learning is always occurring. So if
Hmm.
nature has a framework for learning, I need to continue to focus on that. So now, when we look at ancient philosophy, and they're always wrestling with, well, what's the right moral to have? Well, the moral, in my sense, would be let's look to the logic of nature and how it is constantly evolving, in
Mm.
that one plant does not hate another plant. Poison ivy still hangs out with beautiful, shrubs and flowers. It's still there. A
Uh-huh.
tree doesn't care if it gives, shade to Mother Teresa or, a murderer. It
Yes.
just it just gives all the time, but that giving makes us vulnerable. Those thoughts. And so
Mhm.
to prevent yourself from this sort of infectious bad ideas that come through, I think we need to have these strong frameworks, create this immunity by
Yeah.
understanding that we're all trying to evolve. Even through the mistakes in our learning, even through flat earthing, we're realizing what we don't like, what doesn't work.
Right. And one of the things that has been shown to compromise mental immune systems, like so your mind's filters will begin to break down if you become arrogant. If
Yeah.
you become convinced, if you lose your humility, your ability to investigate and learn begins to decline, and your ability to spot mind parasites, bad ideas, actually starts to decline. So we need a return to humility. What we have today is a online information ecosystem where the boldest, least humble people I'm thinking of right-wing shock jock who pretend to have all the answers, but of course we have people on the left
Correct.
who do this as well. When those are the loudest voices in the room, first of all, nobody can hear themselves think, and we begin to our immunity to bad ideas begins to erode because we're too busy pointing fingers and accusing each other
Yeah.
to really sort things out and really get rid of the bad ideas. For about 30 or 40 years now in America, we've let a culture war get more and more and more um, acute. It's been building. And as that happens, people stop inquiring together in an honest and fair-minded way and instead resort to just turn reasons into weapons for
Yeah.
beating up on the other side. And that's not serving any of us well. And we need everybody right now to lay down their rhetorical weapons and pick up their logical plowshares.
I love the logical plowshares. And think about a virus, right? So say a bad idea comes in and infects a group, or something that is truly a virus. It's going to make people sick.
Mm-hmm.
The acuteness at which it comes in and attacks a specific group then says that you need to physically separate the bodies so that the medium from which this virus transfers cannot do so. So
Mm.
through our acuteness, through this shock jaw approach, right wing, left wing, whatever it might be, by doing that hyper focusing with that negativity and frankly illogical ideas,
Mm-hmm.
you actually create a separation. It doesn't create a binding. It doesn't help you understand the other. It just drives you further away from them. That
Right.
sickness is physically and very non physically driving people apart. And so, if you want to be immune to these ideas, that means I can go to those individuals, whether it be a family member or a business executive or a politician, and I can let them air how they typically air things, how they carry themselves through their speech. And I will not let it infect me, but I can
Mm.
ask questions. I can listen intently, and I can ask them in the most learning format to see, are there really holes to what you're saying? Does it test? Does it pass muster?
Yes. And being ready to listen and learn from good questions is perhaps the one thing we can all do better to strengthen our resistance to bad ideas. I like to say that doubts are the antibodies of the mind.
Mm,
Their purpose is to swarm to bad ideas, identify them, and eliminate them,
lymphatic
neutralize.
system, you know? Oh, wait, we got a sickness over here. Lymphocytes are extremely important to our body, you know?
That's right. And doubts and questions and qualms and reservations, those are like the lymphocytes of the mind,
Yeah.
basically.
But you don't want to, we can doubt, and you know this, but you can't doubt yourself to a fault where then, nothing will ever work for you, right?
Well, you can be too skeptical for your own good.
Mm-hmm.
You can be you, so one of the things that causes conspiracy thinking, for example, is big sweeping doubts. The
Yep.
entire mainstream media is corrupt. The entire mainstream media is a big conspiracy, right? It's a global doubt that makes it so you don't actually have to do the hard work of investigating things on a case by case basis.
Correct.
It's a crutch that will distort your worldview, alienate you from many of the people. That view and others associated with it will alienate you from your fellow Americans, make you feeling more lonely and more desperate to cling to ideas that make you feel special. And it's a negative spiral that has led to some really crazy forms of extremism. And I hope if any of your listeners know people who are getting sucked into rabbit holes, that they can extend trust and the grace of listening to them so that they can hear themselves think and realize how crazy
Yeah.
their ideas have become.
Yeah, you're like, when you do those moments of self reflection, it hits hard for a lot of people. And a lot of people are scared to even get to that point. And whether it's a family matter or a political one, a lot of people have created foundations of their life and their career on things that actually lack a foundation. They're built upon
Mm,
sand.
yeah.
And so when you come in and you do a line of inquiry, and maybe that line of inquiry is public, you can disrupt things for them, and it can also put you in a rock and a hard place. So, how is it that someone should then deal with that sort of scenario, right? Where you're not for harm looking to debase what is going on here, but you need to call out untruth where there's untruth, because
Right.
that's of a greater harm to our evolution as human beings than anything else.
We do need to call out untruths because so many of them today are really threatening our way of life. Um, I mean, the work of debunking bad ideas, the work of spotting untruths and asking people to let go of them
Yeah,
can earn you some enemies. And the most pugnacious and closed-minded people will not welcome your efforts.
yeah,
But we can't simply give up or let the pugnacious, closed-minded people govern the public sphere. We need to push back against them. We need to ask them tough questions.
hmm,
We need to use questions and counter arguments to actually gently wake them up to what they're doing and help them understand that there's a better way, both to create solidarity among fellow Americans, number one, and also to get a better understanding of the world we have to navigate together.
it's funny. You chose the word waking up. It's almost like you're in this dream state where
Mm,
you are at the very moment defining the next part of this dream, wherever it might be, whatever that world may look like. But fundamentally, what you're operating in when you wake up is exactly the opposite of what's going on in that dream state. But you just
mm,
think this is what it is. So it's uncomfortable, and there's something I always like to cite, and it's that the truth is at all times unpopular. And I
mm.
think it's just been like that for so long. And I'm relatively young, but I like to listen. I like to watch, observe. I'm critical, but I don't do it for harm. I really want to learn, right? And, that unpopularity of it is probably because we don't want to focus on ourselves. It's much easier to focus on others. And I think, you teach individuals in their 20s, okay?
Mm-hmm.
What about the earliest portions of our lives? Your parents come in, they're raising you, the
Yeah.
people closest to you, but their foundations lack a lot of logic. And you'd be lucky later on to catch something like that in retrospect. And the hardest thing I've found, the hardest thing is to say that, you know, I respect you as a human being.
Mm.
I know you're close to me. You may think a little screwed up, but I still respect you on your journey of learning. And it's not
Right.
easy.
I love that attitude, right? And it's so important to maintain that attitude even in when conversation starts to get heated, right?
Yeah.
I mean, think about the people closest to you, your best friends or your partner.
Yeah.
If things get tense with that person, you need to display an underlying devotion to maintaining a positive relationship if you
Hmm.
want to work through that your differences in a constructive way. You have to exude moment to moment with your expression and your facial, with your gestures, with your attentiveness,
Right.
that you care about the relationship and that you are willing to do what it takes to maintain that. And it turns out that that collaborative spirit, that spirit of I want to trust you, I want us to have a good friendship. That attitude turns out to be crucial to the proper functioning of our minds. When,
Tell me
when
more.
well, when when suspicion about the global cabal of liberals um,
Oh, you've done quite your study on QAnon, haven't you?
and financier. I've been reading a book about QAnon, which is
Yeah.
kind of on my mind of late. But when these ideas start to occupy your thoughts and you churn on them repeatedly, you become so suspicious, so distrustful of so many people. It cuts you off from others, and it actually makes your mind hyper. It will become hyperactive.
Hmm.
Sorry, let me restate that. In the same way that the body's immune system can overreact to a perceived threat
Right.
and actually attack the body itself,
Correct.
That's called autoimmunity. It's what happens when the body's immune system gets
Invokes on itself.
hypervigilant and right.
Yeah.
So there it turns out there are dozens and dozens of autoimmune disorders of the body. Now it turns out there are also autoimmune disorders of the mind. Your mind can basically generate antibodies, doubts, questions, suspicions, distrust to an unhealthy degree. And it can attack good, reliable information and dismiss it. And when that happens, you can actually lose your grasp of reality because your mind's immune system is betraying you.
Yeah, and that's like, and it's sad, and you see that at a very chemically imbalanced state in mental institutions.
Mm,
It's funny. I can stress myself out and generate cortisol in my body, and it can have very adverse effects to physiological features. I can put on weight. I can decrease certain blood cell counts. I can, tighten my genetic strands, decrease flexibility in the body, makes me
hmm
more rigid, more fragile,
hmm
or depending on how I think, those thoughts can actually physically make me ill. I can actually chemically imbalance myself through that function of thinking.
That's right.
And so when you say mental immunity, it's really not a far off approach to what you're saying. It's a very logical, well founded, cohesive description about what you truly need. It's this equalization of all these catalysts that come around in the world and understanding how you can grow in this immunity, vaccinate yourself from bad idea and disease so that
Right.
when you do move forward, you maintain that healthy balance.
You really seem to grasp the central premise of the book, which is that we haven't understood mental immune health properly, but now that we're learning how the mind's immune system works, we actually have a far better understanding of how we can maintain a healthy balance between suspicion and trust, right? So we can take the findings of this new science. I call it cognitive immunology, the science of mental immunity. We can take this science and we can translate its findings into practical things everybody can do to inoculate, to increase their own resistance to
Yes,
disinformation and propaganda and conspiracy thinking, but also so that we can help one another think more clearly and more capably. We can all become wiser versions of ourselves if we invest in mental immune health,
I love that.
individual and collective.
So, Andy, I know you and I could trail for years on this, and I feel like I'm in a relationship with you now. Um, how would you leave then a final message for people listening to this, or for people right now that are listening to this and be like, "Screw that guy, that's bullshit."
Hmm.
How would you afford them a final thought or question that they could sleep on or chew on for the next week, month, year, or the rest of their lives? What would that look like?
Let me offer you one sort of practical rule of thumb that your listeners can put into practice tomorrow, and then something about a larger project that I'm working on that can help to transform our culture in a more systematic way. So realize first and foremost that challenges to your beliefs aren't threats; they're opportunities. Every time you feel threatened by a piece of information or an argument or somebody else's point of view, talk yourself down, calm your mind, um, nudge yourself out of fight or flight mode, the kind of aggressive, hypervigilant mode where you're ready to go on the attack, and simply say, hey, maybe I have something I can learn here. Maybe this guy has a piece of the truth also. When you do that, your brain actually shifts into a different modality. You become better able to integrate new information into your worldview and develop it in a way that's more richer and more nuanced. We all have to do that. The other thing I hope that I'd like to share with your listeners is that I'm building a nonprofit to research the the mental immune health to,
Love that.
to and then come out with a set of recommendations that can reduce humanity's susceptibility to cognitive contagion. So we're seeing epidemics of nonsense tear our cultures apart right now. We have a very small window in which to deepen our understanding of mental immunity and spread its practical findings in ways that will give us herd immunity, essentially, to epidemics of viral nonsense. But I think we can do this in a few short years if we get the right players pitching in. My nonprofit is called CIRCE, CIRCE. That's short for the Cognitive Immunology Research Collaborative.
It's funny you chose Circes, and because when I think back to Greek culture, Circes was the daughter of a witch.
I think you may be right. I don't know the specifics. She is the I do believe she had some magical power. She's the woman who advised Odysseus on how he could sail past the island of the
The sirens,
sirens without
correct.
succumbing to their seductive song.
No, I listen. I Andy, I think that's fantastic. And at Tartle, our users have the ability to donate the earnings from their data directly towards nonprofits that they would like to, champion or help, thrive. And so we'd be more than happy to list you and Circe's on there to receive donations as those individuals actually earn from sharing their data.
That is music to my ears. I think we've got some very ambitious plans to change the world with this new science, and we'd love to have you guys help us with that. So thank you.
Yeah, most definitely. Most definitely. And if somebody wants to hear more about mental immunity, if they want to find more about you, read your bios, buy the book, where would they go to do something like that?
Well, so the book is available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, wherever books are sold. And you can, if your local bookstore doesn't have it, you can ask them, and they'll probably uh, get a copy for you. But to find out more online, try cognitivimmunology.net.
Okay.
That's the nonprofit. And andynorman.org is the where I uh, where I talk more about my work and my research. So I hope your listeners will check them out and let me know if they're interested in becoming part of the cognitive immunology revolution.
No, listen, I think that's fabulous. And truly, Andy, thank you for coming on. Thank you for carrying a very logical line of reasoning, something I deeply, deeply appreciate. And I know others will too.
Well, I feel like I've discovered a kindred spirit here, and I hope we'll do great things together.
Will do. Thank you again.
All right.